And congratulations for listening to NonTheology, the show here to fill the podcast-shaped hole in your heart. You can visit us online at nontheology.com, and though we're not likable in real life, we are likable on Facebook at facebook.com/nontheology. I am the fully formed and irreducibly complex host, Gabe, and I'm joined, of course, by the transitional host with half an eye and half a brain, Eric.
That's good. Before we begin, did you remember to press the record button?
Well, first of all, yes, I did, and second of all, we already began.
I know, but we can always just start again.
No, it's impossible.
One thing that I did want to mention, just because it was a big deal for a hot minute there, we didn't talk about Duck Dynasty on this show yet, did we?
No, we didn't talk about... Well, you mentioned Duck Dynasty.
I said there was people wearing Duck Dynasty t-shirts at the water park over the Christmas break.
Yeah, I think that counts.
Well, I don't want to go into too much detail, but basically, it's just a bunch of stuff that we've already said on the show before, and it was interesting because this guy from Duck Dynasty, which is this inexplicably popular show, I don't know why people even watch it. I've seen like 5 minutes of it, and that was enough for me to know that it's not for me, and that I don't give a damn what any of the people who are on this show have to say about anything. But the dude who's like the Duck Commander said a whole bunch of really stupid things about homosexuality and got suspended from the show, and then they unsuspended him because a bunch of people freaked out. And really, at the end of the day, I'm sure the network was delighted because it was all this publicity and all that and whatever. But we don't really need to get too much into it. I just thought it was kind of an interesting thing that it was like, once again, a really like front page kind of media story had to do with, are gay people, is it okay for them to be gay? And does it matter what people who disagree with them being gay think?
Yep, long story short, everyone is stupid.
Yeah. Well, I was talking to, this will be my one anecdote about it. I was talking to one of my cousins at grandma's house, and I was just kind of like, she's the most like-minded of my cousins as far as like my opinion about things for the most part. And she was just kind of like, yeah, it's kind of like now when people say things like that, it's just kind of like, oh, you're stupid. Like, you're not a very smart person, so, that's unfortunate. All right, well, anyway, moving on, because we don't care what stupid people have to say.
Right.
Know? And I was kind of like, yeah, that sums it up quite nicely, in my opinion.
Well, we haven't done this in a little while. Eric, do you want to interact a bit with some of what our listeners have said and posted comments about?
Oh, yeah. I feel like we don't get that many comments, so, we have to wait a while and save up a few to have enough to really make it worthwhile to talk about them.
Right on. Listeners, if you like the show, I would massively appreciate it if you would share a link with a friend or write a kind review for us on iTunes. That would help us out a bit. Eric, nodding your head does not make for good radio.
I'm nodding my head in approval because I agree with what you're saying.
Good.
And the listeners to the grace of Christ will know that I'm nodding in approval.
It's not the grace of Christ.
Okay, sure. Something else. They'll find out somehow. Because you said it.
Something else.
Because you told them I was nodding. That's how they found out.
All right, so I got this from our listener and beloved friend, Girl Kevin.
Oh, nice.
Yeah, it says, just listen to your episode with Ellery Shemp. I really enjoyed learning about his court case and others. They will help me build my airtight case for establishing mandatory worship of Stephen Colbert.
That's good. Well, thanks, Girl Kevin. We miss you.
Yeah, although I can't say it's real clear to me how the discussion with Ellery Shemp is going to help you with your court case, but good luck to you.
I think that Stephen Colbert gets enough worship already. I don't know if his ego could really put up with any more. He might just become unbearable if his ego were to grow any more than it already is. That is, of course, when he's in character. I don't think that real Stephen Colbert is unbearable. I think he's delightful and intelligent.
Much more so than you.
I was just going to say exactly that. I was going to say much more so than you. Oh, we talk on the internet too much. I hate you.
Oh, I hate you too, buddy. So we also got what I think is going to be our very first fanboy. His name is Kevin.
Of course, naturally, his name's Kevin.
Yeah. Posted on our Facebook page, I just raped your podcast page of MP3s like a true internet pirate, and I'm currently listening to all of them in order. I've been laughing my ass off all morning. So glad I found you guys. Thanks. I was actually wondering why our server had been huddled in the corner crying and shivering.
In the shower.
Yeah.
Just sitting in the shower with arms resting on the knees. Well, thanks, Kevin. We definitely appreciate that. I think that's really cool that somebody is taking the time to like listen to like all of our stuff. I don't know why anybody would actually ever want to do that.
And I also wouldn't recommend anyone do that.
Because I don't think the show's that good. At least what I'll say is when there's no guests, it's not that good.
Right.
But I'm glad that you like it.
Yeah, he's funny. We've been having a little bit of back and forth. He's an interesting guy. The only problem that I have with him so far is that he recommends that you and I both read the Bible, which I just cannot ever bring myself to do.
I've done enough of that, and I don't know if I'll do any more Bible. I don't want to. It's not. I've seen enough of the Bible that I don't need to go on any longer with that.
I personally just have no interest in holy books. I just don't care, even a little bit.
Yeah, I would tend to agree with you on that. Like the only holy book that I have any interest at all in reading is the Bible, because it's like the one that I already know the most about and the one that I kind of grew up with. I have absolutely no interest at all in reading like the Bhagavad Gita or the Quran or anything like that. Like I just wouldn't be, it wouldn't hold my interest for any more than a few seconds. I'm sure it would just be so, one, stupid, and two, irrelevant to anything that goes on in my life in reality, and three, just boring, completely boring.
Right. Our listeners have also taken to identifying themselves on our blog as Kevin,
which I'm really a big fan of.
Yes, I think that's funny. It's funny that the things we think are funny are also found funny by others.
Other people find them funny, yeah.
Bizarre and terrifying.
It makes me feel like maybe there's a chance for me after all.
We got a comment on the blog. This was on the episode that you had sort of been in charge of, Eric.
Oh boy.
This is the episode 33, Things Eric Found on the Internet.
Yeah.
Where, among other things, we talked about the movie God's Not Dead.
Which, is that out yet, by the way? That comes out in 2014, right? So I guess probably not, because it's
probably not. I think it's like mid-2014.
Just for everybody's frame of reference, it's currently about 5 o'clock in the afternoon on January 18th, 2014.
All right, and so this is also after I changed our tagline from weekly or bi-weekly or whenever we want to do it podcast to the show here to fill the podcast-shaped hole in your heart. All right, so this comment comes from definitely Kevin.
Definitely Kevin. The one and only Kevin.
That's right. Gabe says he can't promise any more time intervals. Really? Weekly or bi-weekly or whenever we want to do it was too much of a commitment for you? Too rigid of a schedule?
Yeah. That's a good point by definitely Kevin there, Gabe.
I mean, yes, it does seem easy, but I'd like to see anyone else do a better job of coordinating a schedule with Eric. It's fucking impossible.
I do make it hard. I do make it difficult.
Yes. Following up on that, Kevin the Second, or maybe it's Kevin E. I don't know if it's a Roman numeral or just two consecutive I's.
Kevin E.
Kevin E. says, loved this episode. My fiance and I lolled all over the road on our anniversary trip to Kentucky.
Yeah, that's awesome.
Yeah.
It's really the thought of like two people who are like, you know, married, so like adults in some way, I guess.
Eric, a fiance is not the person that you're married to.
In a serious adult relationship that they'll eventually be married. Listening to us while they like go on a road trip is just that's just really kind of strange to think of. I did never think when we started doing this that there would actually be people who were like, hey, we listened to this while we did this and we liked it. So that's really, I got a kick out of that when I read it.
Yeah, it's odd to me that someone would share our podcast with someone whom they want to have like a strong opinion.
Right? Yeah. I was thinking,
like my fiance, I want her to like me. I'm going to share this podcast with her. That just seems like a terrible idea.
Yeah, right. Yeah, like I sort of pictured all of our listeners sound like headphones in, like, you know, in the corner, like whatever screen they're using to access it, like turned away from anybody who could possibly see it, just kind of sitting there, and then like, you know, pretending like they're listening to music or something. I don't...
Bobbing their head up and down so no one gets suspicious.
Yeah. Looking at other people in the room, like pointing at their phone or whatever, and going, "Yeah, it's a good song. It's a good song."
Another comment on that episode. I don't listen to podcasts repeatedly, but I've listened to this one several times. So, yeah, cool. I guess awesome. People really liked that episode. I got mad at that point and said, all right, if Eric's episode gets any more compliments, I'm quitting the podcast.
That episode did go off pretty well, I thought. The movie trailer was just so strong on its own that it would have been hard for us to mess it up.
Right. Right.
Kevin Sorbo, he's the man.
Yeah, we were standing on the shoulders of giants with Kevin Sorbo.
Yeah, Hercules. TV's Hercules, not a giant, but that's okay. There were giants on the show, if I recall. You know, they had some tricky camera angles to make people look taller and stuff, and some very early CGI kind of things. I think I'm going to start commenting on the NonTheology website under just different names. Like, oh my God, it's so funny. Eric's the man. Everything Eric says is a stitch. And then everybody's going to know that it's me because nobody would describe a funny thing as a stitch other than me because people don't do that.
So yeah, those were fun comments to get to read. I enjoy when people comment and share their thoughts about the podcast with us. It's always fun.
And none of them were negative either, which I like that, but I also don't like it because one of my favorite things to do is to think of reasons why I disagree with the people who say bad things about us.
Well, if we want to get into some of the negative comments, we've got plenty of those as well. Most of them directed at you, by the way.
Oh, yeah.
But anyway, those have all been fun stuff for me to read and comment back and forth with our listeners about. So anyway, Eric, before we get into the show, do you want to play a game of Wait What?
You already know the answer to that question. I always want to play Wait What. Even when we're not doing the show, I want to play Wait What. When I'm at work, I'm like, man, I'd rather play Wait What right now than...
Yeah, Eric calls me up and he's like, hey, Gabe, can we just play Wait What real fast? And it's like,
can we play Wait What, Gabe?
Eric, I'm at work. Eric, it's 3 a.m. All right, so this is going to be a fun one. I'm going to give you Who Said It. This is from conservative commentator Alan Keyes.
I'm not sure if I've heard of him.
Yeah, you probably haven't. He writes at WorldNet Daily.
Oh, okay. So I probably definitely haven't heard of him.
All right, so something is going to lead to some undesirable situations, and it'll be your job to guess what that something is based on what it'll lead to. So I'm going to give you the effects, and you have to guess what the cause is.
Okay, so I have to figure out what the root of the problem is.
That's right.
You're going to give me the problem, and I have to tell you why it's happening. That's
right. All right, you ready?
Yeah.
All right. The cause that you have to guess is going to lead to communism, the murder of the masses, and the overthrowing of America's historically exceptional government.
Communism, mass murder, and the overthrow of the government. Well, when people start talking about mass murder, they make me think of like Stalin was an atheist, so, or like Hitler was a Darwinist, so that means that the evolution is the cause of the Holocaust. So I would say either evolution in schools. Evolution in school.
Ah, close. It's a different scary thing.
Gay marriage, then.
Yes, it's going to be gay marriage. Gay marriage is going to lead to communism, mass murder, and the overthrowing of America's government, according to Alan Keyes.
Does he offer up any reasons for why that's going to lead to those things, or is that just his opinion?
No, it just seems to be something he's saying.
Is there some kind of historical precedent or some kind of like study that they did or something to show that after people have been around gay marriage for X amount of weeks or months or years, or after X amount of gay people are married in your neighborhood, it makes you want to overthrow the government or something like that? Like, where are those things coming from?
Well, our listeners are going to have to go and check out the article if they really want to dig into Alan Keyes' bizarre dystopic world that he's talking about. But I can definitely say that there is absolutely zero precedent for a nation acknowledging same-sex marriage and then getting overthrown and adopting communism.
Yeah, I mean, it's
getting overthrown, adopting communism, and then murdering everyone.
Then everybody getting killed. If you're going to make just whacked out claims like that with no like real good decent reasoning behind it, you could say whatever you want and have the exact same like credibility behind your statements. I could say that if gay marriage gets accepted in the United States, the world is literally going to explode. And I will have just as much reasoning behind what I'm saying as Alan Keyes does with his argument there.
That's right.
Gabe, if gay marriage gets accepted, lasers are going to come start shooting out of my eyes. I'm going to burn my house down and everybody else's house in the whole neighborhood. Because I'm going to, out of sheer confusion, I'm going to have to run around outside and shoot laser beams around at other people's houses, and they're going to ignite and blow up.
You're going to have to constantly look for houses of people who will help you and accidentally burn their houses down.
Keep blowing their houses up, dude. Yeah. I would say that Alan Keyes and I are on about equal footing logically and as far as what we're saying being reasonable.
Yeah.
In this context.
Now, Alan Keyes ends his article with just this brilliant couple of sentences. So He suggests that our will to resist abuses is what created the United States in the first place. And he goes on to then say, if today that will has failed, its failure will be the headstone that marks our nation's demise. Be advised, this tragic conclusion is the purpose of the whole gay marriage maneuver. Now, I can vouch for him on that one, because, my gay friends, I know they're all sitting amongst themselves saying, I hate my country so much that I want to marry the person I love.
Yeah, it's like he's made it out to sound like gay people who want to marry other gay people, just their whole point of it is to throw the country into complete and utter chaos and murder people.
Right. As if achieving equal marriage rights is the means on the way to the end, which is overthrowing the country. It's just such a bizarre way of thinking.
It would have made more sense to me if it was some sort of like slippery slope argument where like first it'll be gay marriage is okay, then something else will be okay, then something else will be okay, then before you know it, it's okay to murder people, and then, martial law and communism and blah, whatever. But it just seems to me like he thinks that gay people are like really like conspiring to murder people.
Right.
It's just not that the slippery slope argument makes any sense at all, but this makes even less sense than that, I think.
Yeah, Right Wing Watch, which is where this article came from, notes basically the same thing you're saying. They say, we're not exactly sure how allowing same-sex couples to marry will stop other couples from getting married and having children, but this is a recurring theme in Key's nightmares of the coming gay dystopia. I can't actually tell whether coming gay dystopia is supposed to be a pun or not, but because that would certainly terrify Mr. Keyes at least as much as them getting married.
Yeah. I don't know. I mean, is it okay to call all homosexuals who want to get married like conspiring to murder? Like, I don't know if I feel like that's not all right on some level. I don't think you can say that.
Yeah, I don't know if it's okay to call like this entire social class treasonous.
Yeah, right. Yeah.
I don't know. It's apparently fine by Mr. Keyes and WorldNet Daily, so.
Interesting.
Yeah. All right, well, let's move on to the rest of the episode. Eric, what on earth are we talking about today?
Oh, well, the kind listeners got a little preview of it when you did your introduction and said that I was transitional and that you were irreducibly complex or something like that. I can't remember what you said. But we're going to talk about bad arguments against evolution.
Oh, yes, that's right. Which the world is just full of excellent examples of bad arguments against evolution.
Right, and I don't know everything that you're going to want to bring up, but just the small list of things that I cooked up, that I thought I wanted to talk about just entertains me to no end, so I'm sure that this will be a good one.
All right, so we've pulled a couple of these out. There's no way that we can cover every single bad objection to evolution, because there's just so many. I mean, I never would have been able to imagine that there were so many bad objections to evolution. It's astounding, the quantity and diversity of this list of bad objections to evolution. It's bizarre.
Basically, the response to every single thing that you're going to bring up, I'm sure, would just be that the correct response from somebody who is not a crazy evolution denialist is you don't understand what evolution actually is, and the things that you're saying are not what evolution says happens.
Well, so there's...
Or you're just flat out wrong.
Yeah.
That's also possible.
That's right. There's two categories that these can usually fall into. One is a misunderstanding of what evolution is, and the other is a misunderstanding about the world around you.
A misunderstanding of what actual things are.
Right. Because someone can have a perfectly good understanding of evolution and be like, well, yeah, but the Earth is only like 2,000 years old, so this stuff didn't evolve.
Yeah.
So, Eric, do you want to start us off, or do you want me to?
Well, okay, Gabe, evolution can't be real because something can't come from nothing.
Oh, I guess that's right. Podcast is over, huh?
Something can't come from nothing. So if evolution is true, then where did the universe come from?
So there would be, I guess, two realms in which you could address this question. One is, if the person is saying the universe comes from nothing, well, this is not a problem for evolution, because that's not what evolution talks about.
Right. I'm glad you mentioned that, because that's one thing that I see all the time is people who want to argue about evolution, and then they start arguing about things that aren't evolution. Like the origin of the universe or abiogenesis are not evolution.
Right.
That's not what that is. And people conflate those two things two of those three things all the time, and it boggles my mind. But anyway, sorry, go on. I don't want to...
Well, yeah, but so there's that problem of, the origin of the universe, the origin of time, space, matter, and energy. That's one problem, but that has, zero to do with evolution. someone might be saying, though, that something can't come from nothing, and when they say that word something, they're referring to life, a proto-organism or something like that. But in that case, I mean, they've inched sort of incrementally closer to the topic of evolution, but still, that's abiogenesis, and that's not what evolution is. Evolution, to a very large extent, in fact, I'd say almost exclusively, is talking about how life changes once life pretty much already exists. Now, we can go back in time and probe at that early life and talk about sort of Darwinian mechanisms that would result in evolutionary stability of these things, even though they're not alive. You've got basic individual replicators and stuff like that. But, I mean, still, you're not talking about evolution if you're talking about where life came from, and certainly not if you're talking about where the universe came from.
And I one thing that I want to mention, just because hopefully you can jog my memory a little bit. But one thing I think is super interesting is like they did an experiment where they were trying to. I mean, it's a very famous experiment. I can't remember the names of the people involved.
I bet you're going to talk about the Miller-Urey experiment.
I think so. I think Miller was one of the guys where like they basically took like the sort of like primordial soup. I'm doing air quotes when I say primordial soup, or like the matter that we suspect that like the early, the Earth, the matter that the Earth consisted of before life existed on it, and then
the prebiotic Earth.
Yeah, that one. And then they like shot it with some lightning bolts and stuff, and found that like that they found that like that stuff on its own can actually form organic compounds and start to form early compounds that like life then, living organisms emerged out of. And I think that that's really interesting, that even though this isn't strictly speaking evolution, like I was saying before, but it is interesting to me that they've sort of done experiments that are kind of like, oh yeah, under these conditions, life could just kind of happen.
Well, and so the Miller-Urey experiment, first of all, a little bit more about what it was about. What they did is they took this enclosed flask it was mostly water, but they added some carbons and some nitrates and ammonia and some very basic elements.
Right, which are things that were on the prebiotic Earth, right?
That's right, yeah.
Yes. They didn't just pick shit at random. They picked shit that was like what the conditions on Earth were like back then. Yeah.
Yeah, some water, some carbon, a couple hamsters.
A few Bud Lights.
Yeah, so they put some very simple, non-organic compounds into this, and they were running some electricity through it periodically. And what was happening was amino acids were spontaneously being generated in this just electrified soup. Amino acids are the building block of proteins, proteins being the building block of life. So you've got the building blocks of the things that actually do the replication and create life, cell division, DNA replication, stuff like that. And so before that experiment had been done, life and organic compounds were this very special thing that were very separated from chemistry. And so what that experiment showed is actually there's this really cool and really deep unification between what's going on with these biological molecules and amino acids and just basic organic chemistry.
Yeah, that's a cool thing. Back when I was in high school and I actually took science classes, when I found out about that experiment, I was like, oh, that's super neato. And I like read the Wikipedia page and stuff, and that was a long time ago.
Right. Now, of course, it's important to point out that the Miller-Urey experiment didn't create life. It didn't come close to creating life. That is something that has still kind of eluded scientists to a really large degree. But it showed that, like, the basic stepping stones kind of exist. You don't need any sort of special magical force to create these basic biological molecules.
Right. But it's still a neat thing.
Right. The dumb thing that people say sort of in response to that is, well, clearly these biological molecules could only have been created by an intelligent mind and creator, because you needed this super smart scientist to come in here, create this flask and add the water and add the ammonium and stuff like that.
Yeah, that's why I took the time to point out that it wasn't just random shit that they threw in the flask. It was like, no. The flask represents like what the Earth was back then. And the stuff we put in it was like what the stuff that was there was. So that's just like the naturally occurring Earth is what the flask represents. So like that argument like misunderstands the whole point of it.
Yeah, exactly. Creating those basic, simple biomolecules is not something that required a special mind to figure out how to do. It's just this dumb mechanistic mix of electricity, water, and ammonia, and some other stuff. I mean,
yeah.
it doesn't at all require someone to sit down and be like, oh, well, if you attach this point to this point and assembling molecules
right.
by hand or anything like that, it's dumb.
Doesn't make a whole lot of sense.
All right, so that's a good stupid objection to evolution. I've got another one.
That's a good jumping off point, I think.
All right, Eric, how about the objection that evolution takes too much time to have ever been observed because you need millions and millions of years for macroevolution?
Well, okay, there's a lot of things we can talk about with this. For starters.
Actually, to start off, let me make sure that we've got a handle on what the objection they're actually making is. So, evolutionary changes in a population happen over successive generations. And you need a lot of generations to see any change at all. So human generations, for example, 20 years or so. And if you need 10 or more generations to see evolution happening, then you're not going to get to see it happening. So, all right. So that's the objection they're making. What do you think?
Well, that's stupid. One, because we don't necessarily have to like sit in a chair and not get up until we've seen it happen. You know what I mean? Like, we still can know that it's happening without, constantly like staring at it. We have enough ways of finding out about these kind of things.
No, Eric, the only way you can do science is to sit down in a lab with a stopwatch and wait for this thing to start and stop.
Wait for it to happen and don't get up until it's... And don't look away. Don't blink either.
I swear to God, if you blink, it's not science.
But I guess the first thing that's jumping into my mind is that it's just wrong. Like, maybe one single person can't like watch a species, evolve. I guess I'm doing air quotes again when I say evolve, just because of the way that they want to use the word. It's probably not the correct way that a scientist would use the word. But like, the thing I'm thinking of is like, are you familiar with what a ring species is?
Yeah. Do you want to tell our listeners what a ring species is?
Yeah. So essentially what happens is like, you get one animal, and then the population of that animal will spread off in two different directions. And then eventually what'll happen is they will wind up re-meeting up with each other years later in a different location. So like, a good example of this would be like birds that live sort of in the northern part of the world, and like population of birds went east and west and then eventually met up like on the other side of the world kind of thing. And by the time the population rejoins its, re-meets up with its like original like ancestors, it's obviously not like the same birds that traveling around the world, but like by the time that they originally meet back up with their ancestors, they're no longer able to reproduce with each other because there's been so much variation just in the time that it's taken the like bird species to sort of migrate around the world, that now they're not compatible anymore. And so that would be, in my opinion, because that's something that we have observed to happen. It doesn't take billions and billions of years for that to happen. It takes like maybe a couple of decades probably for that to happen, like that.
So ring species and speciation in that regard usually takes more than a few decades. You're looking at like a couple hundred years at least.
Okay, yeah, that's centuries is probably what is the word I was searching for.
Yeah, there's a couple of like archetypal locations that this sort of stuff happens. So you can think of a ring of islands where there's nothing in the center, but these islands, just if you were to trace from island to island, it would form a ring. And so a species starts on one island, moves clockwise to the next island, to the next island, to the next island, etc. And this has happened sort of slowly over time. So by the time these species migrate full circle back to the original island, the species that arrives there is so different that they can't mate anymore. They can't interbreed with the species that's on the original island.
And that, after you've heard about that, if you're denying macroevolution, as you so eloquently put it,
Or speciation would be the more interesting event in this sense.
But if you're going to be one of these people who denies speciation or macroevolution, and you hear about a ring species, you can either pretend like the definition of speciation is something other than what was just described to you and say, oh, no, that's not what that is. That's something else. Or you can just pretend like ring species don't exist and carry on with your original belief set.
Right. This objection actually reminds me a lot of... a few episodes back, I had my friend Dan on the show to talk about gay marriage, and there's an objection to gay marriage to the tune of homosexuality is wrong because it doesn't happen in nature or it's unnatural or something. And Dan's response was perfect. It was along the lines of, well, that's not true, but even if it were true, it would be irrelevant.
Yeah, right.
Yeah. This really has like the same exact issue. So the first thing you ask is it true? And, well... No, it's not. So why is it not true?
We can observe these things.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, there's two ways to go down this route. So first of all, big mammals like primates, pigs, elephants, horses. I'm flashing back to our anachronisms in the Book of Mormon episode now.
Deers.
Yeah, tapirs. These animals take years to get to the next generation, decades in some cases. But, it's not like those are the only organisms that we can observe. We can study other organisms, for example, that can crank out a new generation in a matter of hours. So you start looking at bacteria, they can do this in a matter of hours. As you get into yeasts and insects and other stuff, and you're looking at a few days to the next generation. These are the kinds of organisms that evolutionary biologists and geneticists study when they need to get a species change over thousands and thousands of generations. So we can very easily observe lots and lots of generations in a pretty short period of time if we really want to. You've just got to be selective about which species you're going to be looking at.
Yeah, and like you said, you don't even really need a microscope. Fruit flies and like tiny little insects and shit, like generations happen really, really quickly. So, if you want to watch, human evolution, it's going to take a while because humans nowadays live until they're 90, and
Right.
so we don't have children all that frequently. But when you talk about like insects who reproduce by the thousands daily, it's going to take a lot less time for changes to occur. So those changes can be observed much more easily.
So there's that aspect of it, but in addition to all of that, we've also got the evidence from the fossil record that shows evolutionary changes over geologic timescales. We can actually see what's going on anatomically over the course of hundreds of millions of years, and we can see the anatomy changing over time, and in some cases, we get these beautiful long lines of fossilized evidence of these animals changing over time. It's really cool.
Right, so that's kind of what I meant when I said, like, we have enough ways of finding out about this stuff that we don't actually have to, like, watch it happen with our own two eyes to know that it's happening. Like, the fossil record is a good example of that.
Yeah, exactly. There's an animal called a titanothere. It went extinct about 28 million years ago, and it looks like a really big rhinoceros. So this was a really big bony animal, and those tend to fossilize a lot better than small, soft organisms like you, Eric. So we've got a pretty cool number of these things fossilized and its ancestors. So we can see how it went from this small little thing and got bigger and bigger and bigger, and we can see how its anatomy changes. We can see the changes in its head and its skull and its teeth as its diet changes. Lots and lots of really cool stuff. And so we don't need to rely exactly and specifically on looking at just organisms as we see them right now. The geological record is kind of a time machine for us looking back at what was happening in the past. So that's one aspect. That's one reason why that objection, first of all, isn't true. Let's also visit the why is it irrelevant?
Just because you can't see something happening doesn't mean it's not happening.
Right, yeah.
That's why it's not relevant.
Right. I mean, direct observation by a human over the course of her lifetime is not at all a requirement for any kind of knowledge, scientific or otherwise. Astronomy is full of things that happen on timescales that exceed a human lifetime. A great example of this is the orbit of Pluto. It was discovered about 85 years ago, and it takes about 250 years to orbit the sun. Now, how the hell do we know that if it's barely had the time to complete 1/3 of its orbit over the course of the time that it's existed, right?
And that's not how long it's existed. That's just how long we've known it's there.
All right, yeah, so I misspoke. It's not how long it's existed, it's how long we've known it's existed. But the question is, how can we know that it takes 250 years to orbit the sun if we've only known about it for 85 years?
Okay, I'm the wrong person to ask. I'm really, really bad at math, but I'm sure there's an equation you can use where you can look at the arc of its orbit and decide how long it takes for it to move between two shorter distances, and then use that information to figure out how long it will take to go around the whole sun.
Right.
I'm sure you can do that.
So the actual equation is a little bit different from that. I don't want to get too much into orbital mechanics, but it's actually just a function of how far it is from the sun.
Oh, well, that's interesting. Yeah. Do you have to use triangulation?
No.
That sounds like the right word for this conversation. You have to triangulate the distances.
I mean, that's what you would use to figure out the distance in the first place, I guess. So sure. So there you go. You made the right sounds to be relevant to the conversation.
Yes. Yeah. But anyway, that's like I said, I'm the wrong person to ask, but I know there is a way to figure out how long it would take to go around, even if you haven't seen it happen.
We're actually getting totally off track. There's no need for us to talk about orbital mechanics and equations of orbital period and stuff like this. The point of this is, you don't need to sit down with a stopwatch, time when Pluto starts at one point, wait for it to cross back in the same orbital path again and stop. All right, 250 years.
250 years, we got it.
Yeah, exactly.
Can you imagine training your replacement for that job? All right, Steven, Jeremy started this stopwatch 100 years ago, and he died 50 years ago, and I've been sitting here ever since, watching Pluto go around the sun with his stopwatch on. And we need you to sit here. We need you to sit here in this chair and watch Pluto and watch the stopwatch until you're gonna die. And it still won't be around the sun yet. But so eventually we're gonna have somebody else come and take your place. But somebody needs to be sitting here watching Pluto just so we can make sure it doesn't go anywhere.
It doesn't go anywhere.
Make sure it doesn't go anywhere except for where we see it going around the sun.
Right. Right. I wouldn't accept that job.
I think we're better at stuff than having to do it that way.
Yeah, so that objection is both untrue and even if it were true, it's irrelevant.
It wouldn't matter. Right.
Right.
Okay, so one thing I want to touch on just briefly, and it kind of goes back to what we were talking about before we started talking about space and shit.
Space is cool, by the way. Everyone likes space.
Yes. Is this distinction between microevolution and macroevolution that we have brought up?
Yeah.
Now, correct me if I'm wrong, but evolutionary biologists and archaeologists and people who actually study this and are actually real scientists, they don't use the terms microevolution and macroevolution, do they?
I don't know that they do, but regardless, I think that is a decent or halfway meaningful distinction to be made.
Okay.
So if we're going to use the term microevolution and macroevolution, the way that I think that a lot of people actually in this field, actual biologists would be talking about it, is microevolution is variation that happens below the species level. So, Eric, you and I, we have differences between us. You have curlier hair than me. I'm a little bit taller than you.
I'm way better looking than you are.
No, that's untrue. But, you and I are the same species, so that would be microevolution because this is variation among members of the same species. Now, if you're talking about macroevolution, that would tend to be variation between species and, to some extent, speciation events, creating different species. So,
got it, okay.
So, for example, the animal I was talking about a second ago, the Titanothere, modern-day horses actually evolved from that animal. If you were to look at the bones of a horse and the bones of a Titanothere, they're obviously very different creatures. One is like the size of a house, the other is a horse. And that would be a macroevolutionary event, or a distinction to be made, because it's you've created a different species.
Fair enough. All right, well, that's a good definitions then of it, I guess. But what I'll hear is microevolution happens because it takes a special kind of moron to try to deny the fact that, like, you can, use antibiotics on some bacteria and it will kill, like, a lot of the bacteria, but it won't kill all of it.
Right.
And then that bacteria that survived the antibiotic will then go on to reproduce other bacteria that are also resistant to that antibiotic. And then you have, like, a new strain of bacteria.
Right.
And so the initial antibiotic that you use will be completely useless against this bacteria. So that would be what even people who deny evolution would say is a microevolution. And they'll say that can happen, and part of the reason probably why they admit that happens is because, like I said, it's something that you can observe happening very quickly, and it takes a special kind of idiot to say no, that's not how that works, because it's a pretty well established fact that happens. But you can't have a macroevolution, and what they'll say that one kind can't turn into another kind. You've heard that before, right?
Yeah, I've heard that.
Now, I'm quite certain that a kind is not a vocabulary term that a scientist is going to be using in their research papers and peer review articles. Am I correct in that?
Yeah, I wouldn't think so.
Right. Okay. So basically, what happens?
At least it wouldn't be a technical term, as far as I'm concerned.
Right. Yeah.
I'm not a biologist, so I don't know.
Right. But basically, they use a word that scientists don't use, and they'll just say, "Oh, that can't happen. One kind can't turn into another kind." And so that's interesting to me, and that's kind of what I was thinking of earlier when I was talking about the ring species. Like, if that would be one kind turning into another kind because they can't reproduce with each other anymore. So I just kind of wanted to mention that real quick.
Right, and so what an anti-evolutionist will try and do, the tactic they'll take in response to that, is they'll just broaden the word kind. They'll say, well, it's still a bird, whatever, it doesn't matter. Yeah. And if you show examples where something has gone from a reptile into a bird, and they're convinced that is in fact what's happened, well, it's still an animal, whatever, who cares?
Right. It's still not a person. It's still not a crocoduck.
Right.
So yeah, then they'll broaden the definition until the definition is so broad that it's completely pointless, or they will
it's still a living organism. Yeah, it didn't turn into a computer.
Yeah. So they'll make the definition of kind so broad that it's a completely pointless word, or they will describe processes that evolution doesn't say happen, like Kirk Cameron's famous Fox News thing where he says, "Well, you've never seen this," and he shows up a picture of a crocodile, which is a duck with the head of a crocodile. Yeah. And you just want to raise your hand and be like, "Oh, well, Mr. Cameron, the reason why we never find those is because that's not what evolution says is going to happen."
And you know what? That would be so extraordinarily problematic to evolution if you've got these wildly different species that are interbreeding with one another, like ducks and crocodiles.
Right, yeah.
Or this is actually another thing that is related to dumb objections to evolution. People will say, well, how come we don't see dogs giving birth to cats or stuff like that?
Yeah, well, I mean, that's just falls into the category of you're misunderstanding what the process is. If you expect to see a dog turn into a cat, you don't know what evolution is.
Right.
You should learn what the actual thing is before you argue against it.
Right. A dog giving birth to a cat would be really problematic. That would be at least as problematic as a dog giving birth to a tomato or an ice cream machine.
Right, yeah. It's really easy to argue against things when you don't properly say what the things are that you're arguing against. You know, like Kirk Cameron saying that there's never been a crocoduck is evidence against evolution would be like saying, you know, well, Obama is a better president than Bush because I can jump through the atmosphere by myself. I can achieve escape velocity just by running and jumping really fast.
Yes, yeah. Actually, the Talk Origins website has a good quote that I think sums up what you're talking about. It says, quote, "A large part of the reason why creationist arguments against evolution can sound so persuasive is because they don't address evolution, but rather argue against a set of misunderstandings that people are right to consider ludicrous."
Yeah, and so just on this topic, another thing that I did want to bring up was I hear all the time, well, if we supposedly came from apes, then why are there still apes? And it's like, well, because you don't understand what the process is. Humans and apes came from a common ancestor. Humans and apes are like brother and sister, and the thing that we came from is like mom. That's like,
right.
There's a Thunderfoot video where he addresses this point, and he says kind of like, well, if Americans came from Europe, why are there still Europeans? And so I wanted to just kind of bring that out just because I hear that all the time.
Well, it's funny because saying if humans came from monkeys, why are there still monkeys is similar to saying if Americans came from Europeans, why are there still Europeans? Because it seems to assume that if thing A comes from thing B, then as soon as thing A gets created, thing B has to die immediately.
Thing B, yeah, you have to delete thing B from the equation. Yeah.
Right, yeah. Thing B can no longer be a part of the universe if it created thing A.
Yeah, there's a famous clip that I've seen on YouTube, and it's of some sort of like celebrity Big Brother show. I've never seen Big Brother, but I kind of understand the premise. And it's one point where all the people on the cast, all of these, you know, celebrities who used to be celebrities and now are trying to resurrect their careers by being on this stupid reality show. They're all sitting around the room and they're talking about evolution, and it's one of the Baldwin brothers, like not the famous one, but like Billy Baldwin, or you know, one of the stupider. They're all kind of dumb as far as I can tell, but one of the dumber ones than Alec Baldwin, who's the most famous one. They're sitting around and he says something just like that, where he's like, "Yeah, well, like, you know, I guess if we're supposed to have come from apes, and it's just like, you know, there's still a lot of apes around, so it just doesn't really make a whole lot of sense to me." And then everybody else in the room is just like, "Yeah, you know what? I think you're right." And I'm just like, wow, that's horribly frustrating that was on TV at some point, and all these people who don't have a damn clue what on earth they're talking about all just like sit around and like kind of decide on their own that evolution doesn't exist because of reasons that aren't evolution related, you know?
Well, because this celebrity's brother said so.
Right, yeah. Yeah.
Well, the other thing that you've reminded me of is, you know, when people try and make these distinctions between microevolution and macroevolution, which, of course, let's be honest, in order to be even halfway sensible, they're gonna need to do. Microevolution is just so obviously well attested. I mean, this is just such a common part of our world that you get microevolution. The flu virus mutates from year to year, and that's why we keep getting it instead of our immune systems just being resistant to it all the time. We keep getting it over and over again, not because our immune system, like, forgets the flu virus or something, but because the flu virus mutates every year and becomes a different thing that our immune system has to relearn how to deal with every year.
Same thing with the common cold. That's why there's no, like, again, in air quotes, there's no cure for the common cold, because you can't just vaccinate for the common cold because it mutates so much and changes so much. A cold that you've had before, you'll be immune to, but the next time you get a cold, it's a different virus than the one you had before.
Yeah, exactly. Like the AIDS virus is the exact same way. Viruses are actually very good at this sort of thing. If the AIDS virus, when it sort of first came onto the scene, if that had stayed exactly the way it was, it would have stood no chance against modern-day antivirals, retroviral drugs, things like that. But the advantage that the AIDS virus has is that it keeps changing itself. It makes imperfect copies of itself, and they sort of explore the conceptual space around where they are. Like, oh, I can make myself a little bit differently, and then these drugs will not be quite so effective against me, stuff like that. And that's why the AIDS virus has been so persistent and so effective at propagating itself, is because it constantly changes itself, and it's hard to make drugs that consistently target just that.
Right.
But so, when people acknowledge microevolution but still deny macroevolution, there's this assumption that there's like this wall beyond which you can't evolve. Dogs can get curlier hair, or dogs can get slightly longer legs or smaller bodies or things like that. But no, they can't speciate. They can't become different species. That's just impossible. But there's no reason to think that that's the case. In fact, we have lots of instances where things do become completely different species that can interbreed, that have different anatomy and different coloration, different behaviors, all sorts of stuff.
And so, yeah, that whole idea that, like, there's this wall of separation between microevolution and macroevolution just is not there, or is just really silly.
Yeah, and I guess I'm glad we spent so much time talking about it just because I hear it so much. I heard it at Thanksgiving this year from one of my family members, and I just couldn't. Well, this conversation's over. I'm not having this. We're not doing this right now. Sorry. Grandma's here. This isn't happening.
Well, and so for the next year's Thanksgiving, you can just refer your grandma to our podcast.
Yeah, I'm sure she'll love that.
Listen, Grandma, I don't mean to be short with you, but we've already covered this in the podcast. You can just go ahead and listen to it if you want.
You can reference my show.
All right, so that's a good, stupid objection to evolution. I've got another one here. When people say that evolution can't be true or isn't right or something, and the reason for this is just anything that Darwin was wrong about or didn't know about when he published The Origin of the Species, or anything else that some biologist didn't know when their work was published. Have you heard that one, Eric?
Yes, and sort of akin to that, I was going to bring up, Hitler was a Darwinist.
Right.
Hitler believed in Darwin, so that means that evolution can't be real. If evolution is real, then there's nothing to stop us from just murdering each other because there's no absolute principles by which we have to live our lives by. We're just an accident, so that means it can't be right.
Yeah, you're right. So you've kind of introduced a broader notion about what I'm talking about. I'm referring to biologists who are wrong about other stuff, and you're talking about other people who were right about biology but wrong about other things.
Well, so I guess to your first point, I mean, this is something that, again, it sort of is irrelevant. I mean, and a lot of the reason, at least the thing that's popping into my mind right now, is like science is a largely self-correcting process. Science actually gets things wrong all the time. And then due to the fact that you have the peer review process and you've got just the nature of it constantly trying to disprove things, science can afford to be wrong about things, but then later on realize, oh, that's not correct. It's actually like this. But just because, like the Piltdown Man scandal in England, like just because for a minute there we thought that we had this fossil that was actually not really a fossil, it was actually something that somebody like glued two fossils together. Eventually we found out like, oh shit, this one thing doesn't match up with all the other stuff that we have. So let's go back and look at this one thing that's like the outlier that we don't understand. And oh, wait a minute, it's not real. So like the scientific process is able
This is just a pig's tooth glued to a Coke machine.
Yeah. Yeah, but I mean, like, the process is able to self-correct itself.
In theory, yes, you're right. The scientific method is sort of designed to be a self-correcting process.
Yeah. If you want to say that Darwin was wrong because he was wrong about one minor issue or one point out of the whole entire origin of the species, if one thing in the whole book is wrong, that doesn't make the book wrong. That makes one thing in the book wrong. You know what I mean?
Right. And in the case of Darwin, the sorts of things that a lot of people accuse him of not knowing about, and they're right about, he didn't know about a lot of things that have to do with modern day biology and biochemistry and stuff like that. I mean, it's not relevant to the sort of stuff that The Origin of the Species was talking about, and that is essential to the modern day notions of evolutionary biology.
Just because he didn't know about a lot of the things that were going on like the microscopic level, or maybe like why things were happening, that doesn't change what his observations were about the birds in the Galapagos. Like he still was able to make observations and then say like, oh, based on these observations, I think this. That that doesn't make the conclusion wrong just because he didn't know things, or maybe like part of it is wrong.
Right.
It's just kind of a silly little argument that doesn't really make a whole lot of sense.
Yeah. I think it was Stephen Meyer, who's a proponent of intelligent design. He works at the Discovery Institute. They're big proponents of intelligent design in schools and science classes and awful things like that.
Yeah.
And he was talking about how Charles Darwin really knew very little about the cell. He thought it was just a glob of goo with nothing going on inside. But in reality, there's all this really complicated molecular machinery that Darwin just had no idea about. And Stephen Meyer is totally right about that. Darwin had almost no idea what was going on inside of the cell. But it doesn't matter even a little bit, because Darwin wasn't talking about what was going on inside of cells. Darwin was talking about how species change from one to the other, the origin of the species. He's talking about the origin of the diversity among all the species that we see.
Yeah, I don't have anything else to add. Well said.
Yeah, I've got one more thing.
Go ahead.
Why don't they bring up the same argument against other people in other fields? I mean, Isaac Newton was sort of one of the first people to really thoroughly develop a lot of our field of optics. How come they don't talk about the fact that Isaac Newton didn't know that light is actually both a wave and a particle? He didn't even address what its sort of fundamental nature was. He was just talking about it. Does that make Isaac Newton wrong about optics? No, definitely not. hardly anyone who started off the fields of
anything.
Of anything. Like,
Yeah.
no one who started off these early fields really knew about the deep interworkings of them and how they were going to work. All of electricity, like all of our governing equations about electricity and stuff like that, started off when people thought electricity was a fluid that flowed from thing to thing, and it's like not at all.
Wait, so Gabe, what you're telling me is, correct me if I'm wrong, that the longer we study things, the more we learn about them?
No. Nope, not even a little bit.
Okay.
Because we start off getting direct revelation from God, and that just can't be questioned.
Good, because if you were going to tell me that the more time people spent doing experiments on a given topic or learning about it or studying it or trying to find out more about it, that they would actually then learn more things about it. If you were going to tell me that, I was going to quit the show. I don't think that would
enroll in a theology department.
Right, yeah.
All right, Eric, so what else do you have?
Well, I guess just on the briefly on what I was talking about before, I mostly jokingly threw out the bit about, well, Darwin or Hitler was a Darwinist or whatever, just because once again, that falls under the category of you're not talking about evolution anymore. Whether or not... and
you're talking about Hitler. Yeah, that's not evolution.
And that's a completely different discussion about, whether or not Hitler used evolution to drive the principles of Nazism or whatever. That's a different discussion. But let's say that Hitler did decide that since evolution is true, it's okay to kill 6 million Jews. That doesn't make evolution false. Even
right.
Even if I am willing to concede the original point, which I'm not, but even if I concede that first point, that doesn't change the truth value of the principle of evolution. So it's, again, just people not arguing about evolution, kind of like what I was talking about at the beginning of the show. So whenever people are talking about evolution and they start talking about Pot or Stalin or Hitler, that they're not talking about evolution anymore.
Gay marriage.
Yeah. Whether or not evolution is true is irrelevant in this conversation that you've started having. So I just wanted to bring that up real quick as well. So I guess the other big thing that I wanted to get into, which I would imagine you also wanted to get into as well, Gabe, is here's a couple arguments that I really like. And when I say I like them, I mean they amuse me.
I don't know why you felt like you had to make that distinction. I know what you mean when you say you like something.
What I didn't want anybody to think was that I meant I like it because I think it's true. I'm going to make fun of it.
Okay.
Okay, so Gabe, there's this thing called a bacterial flagellum.
Yep.
And essentially what it is it kind of resembles what you'd find in a car. There's a shaft that spins, and then that goes down and kind of makes like a 90-degree turn, and then there's like a propeller like what you would see on the back of a boat that spins, and that allows bacteria to like move around. And so they can actually like get around with this sort of engine propeller thing, which is like exactly like what you would find on a man-made designed car or boat or something like that. And so there's no way that this bacterial flagellum could have just arisen on its own. And also, the human eye is way too complex to have just sprouted out of nothingness. There's no way that that could possibly happen, because the human eye is so complex, it's irreducibly complex, actually, is what I'm going to say. And so There's no way that it could have occurred naturally. You need some sort of guiding hand in order for the eye to arise as we see it today.
Yeah, so you've brought up two things. One is the bacterial flagellum, and one is the eye. So with the bacterial flagellum, I guess the argument they're making is that it's so close to the thing that we know in the world that is actually obviously designed that we should infer that the bacterial flagellum is also designed. Versus the eye, with the eye, I guess they're saying that it's so complex and so perfect that it couldn't have evolved over time. There's the catchphrase, like, what good is half an eye?
Right. Well,
right?
I've heard the same argument, actually, about the bacterial flagellum, where, like, they say that, like, just this one piece of it where it's like a little complex structure in the bacteria, and the part that actually, like allows it to move would not have had any use to the bacteria as a part of it, or like an earlier stage of it. So it must have just sort of sprouted up all at once on its own, because the individual pieces and parts they're not going to do anything, and they're not going to combine, and it's just going to be there.
Right.
I've heard that the flagellum is too complex as well.
So what do you think, Eric? Are those valid arguments?
No, they're stupid. I mean, the argument from irreducible complexity has been just torn down by evolutionary biologists and people who actually know what they're talking about so many times, and it just refuses to go away, because the people who want this argument to exist either are too thick to understand why it's wrong, or they don't care that it's wrong. They just keep saying it because they want people to think that it's correct. On the eye, I know more about the eye than I do about the bacterial flagellum, so I may let you handle that one. But the eye is really simple. Richard Dawkins, before he got like super into arguing against God and stuff, was really just a good scientist, kind of like Bill Nye is today, who just sort of like popularizes science, kind of like Carl Sagan was back in the day, just a scientist who wanted more people to know about science. And so he made a lot of interesting videos that would sort of describe these things that we're talking about now in simple terms. And like, there's one that you can find really easy on the internet. I'm sure if you just go to YouTube and type like Richard Dawkins, the eye, you can probably find it right away. And it's really cool. He just kind of describes how like the eye is not really all that hard to come up with. And also there are several different kinds of eyes that different kinds of animals have in nature.
Right,
and
right.
they vary in complexity. They vary greatly. You have, at a very simple level, you basically have some animals that just have a surface that can detect whether or not there is light.
Yeah, you get a patch of light-sensitive cells.
Yeah, it couldn't give you a picture. You couldn't see a figure in front of you, but you could tell whether or not the area was illuminated.
Whether the sun is out, whether it's night or day.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And so it doesn't take a whole lot of complexity to enhance that a little bit. Basically, if you take that patch of light-sensitive skin and make it concave, sort of like the shape of what your eye socket is, sort of like make it kind of bend in and form a half circle, then you could tell which direction the light is coming from. And then if you put some sort of transparent film over top of that concave semicircle, or like most of a circle, then you can focus that light and be even more specific about where the light is coming from. And so you can see how it doesn't take a whole lot to get to what we could describe as an eye. And it's not a very complex structure at all. And so the eye that humans have now is just that, but with many, many, many more years of descent and modification. And I guess in sort of a way you could say, improving upon the early eye. And so that alone, I think, is a pretty persuasive argument to suggest that the eye is not so complex that it couldn't have arisen on its own, or at least couldn't have arisen by just natural causes. And at the same time, if you want to talk about the human eye, like it's sort of like this end-all, be-all, like, well, you couldn't have ever had a human eye because it's so awesome. Well, okay, then why do so many people wear glasses? Why do people go blind? Why does the eye suck so bad? Like,
yeah, there's a lot of things about the eye that are not very good.
Yeah.
That don't seem like they would have been designed by some clever designer.
Your eyes are like the easiest way for bacteria and infections to get into your body, or like one of the easiest ways, I should say. Like the eye is prone to like disease and deterioration, cataracts and stuff like that.
Well, even all that stuff aside, just the simple design of the eye as it's normally functioning, like a person with 20/20 vision, there's still dumb aspects of the eye. For example, the eye has a bunch of veins and arteries going through it because it, like every other part of your body, needs to have a blood supply. It's also got, obviously, the rods and cones. These are the light-sensitive components of the eye that tell you whether or not you've got light or dark or red or green or blue. I forget which one does what, but in any event, it's really dumb because you've got all the veins and arteries that cover up all these different rods and cones. So you have rods and cones sitting underneath arteries and veins so that they're not getting any light. And then all these arteries and veins have to go somewhere and come from somewhere. So they all come together in this one specific part in your eye, the very, very back. And that gives you a blind spot. Now, most people aren't actually aware of the fact that they have a blind spot on their eye.
Yeah.
But you do have a blind spot. The fact that you have two eyes sort of covers it up. But if you were to sit down and design like an optical system, you wouldn't design it with a blind spot where the things that are actually light sensitive are going to be covered up by the things that are giving them nutrients. The eyes that squid and octopi have don't have that problem. They have their blood vessels behind the light sensitive part, so there's no problem.
I want this eye to work really well, except for in that one spot. I don't want it to work with that one spot.
Fuck this one spot in particular.
Thanks God for giving us such really awesomely designed eyes that don't work as well as, the eyes of a damn squid.
Right.
So that's great. If you want to trot out the eye as like your evidence of evolution not being correct, then you're not doing a very good job.
Right. Yeah.
And then, the flagellum was the other thing that I brought up. And I've heard the argument, that a part of the flagellum couldn't possibly be of any use to the bacteria. And so then, part of the flagellum would never emerge on its own as a characteristic or a thing that the bacteria possesses. So it must have all just sort of popped into place at once. And that couldn't happen naturally.
Yeah, so the flagellum is another good one as well. So Michael Behe was the first one to sort of point out that the flagellum was what he called irreducibly complex. And by that he meant, you've got this thing with lots and lots of different parts. If you take away a single part from it, then it's not going to work anymore. And he called that irreducible complexity.
Right.
There's also this other argument that you could make, like I was sort of alluding to earlier, that the bacterial flagellum is so close to this other thing, this stator motor that we find designed by humans. If the two are just so similar, one is designed by humans, we should assume the other one is also designed by, obviously not humans, but some designer of some sort. That's not what Behe was talking about when he was talking about the flagellum. He was trying to say that it's irreducibly complex because if you take away a single part from it, it's not going to work anymore.
And so Ken Miller, who's a biologist at Brown University, comes on the scene and shows that this is just a really stupid thing, because what Behe is saying is, if you take away a single part, it won't work anymore as a flagellum. The cell can't use it for locomotion anymore.
Right.
But that's not really the point. That's not really how things evolve. The idea is that if you take away a single part, it might not work as a flagellum anymore, but it will work as something else instead. The analogy that Behe kept using in the book where he was talking about this, Darwin's Black Box, was a mousetrap. You know, you've got the base, you got the spring, you've got the thing that snaps and crushes the mouse, and you've got the thing that holds that in place. So 4 little components. If you take any one of those away, they're not going to work anymore, right?
And it's a pointless piece of crap that you can't use for anything.
Well, no, not at all. And that's what Ken Miller
Right.
was saying. Like, if you take away the part of it that holds it in place until the mouse comes and, like, takes the bait, then you've got something that will basically act like a paper clip. He used it as a tie clip in an interview that he was...
That's funny.
Yeah. Or you can use it for something else. Maybe instead of, if you take away the part that snaps down on the mouse, then you just have a base with a spring and something to hold the spring. And you can do something else with that instead. And so saying that something is irreducibly complex and so it couldn't have evolved from something else because if you take away any of the parts it won't work, that misses the point, because these evolved from other things. And what they showed with the bacterial flagellum is that it's entirely plausible, in fact extremely likely, that this came from a type of secretory system that cells would use to inject stuff. It would basically be a needle.
Yeah, okay, I've heard that before.
I think it's the type 2 or type 3 secretory system, I forget which, but these different things that bacteria would use as basically a needle to inject toxins or viruses into another cell or something like that. So yeah, that whole thing is just kind of missing a lot of important aspects in evolution.
Yeah.
All right, so Eric, you also know that there's no transitional forms that we see today, right? That's a big problem for evolution.
Well, yeah, and this is actually kind of like something that I wanted to talk about. People say that the fossil record's pretty weak, and we're still waiting for that missing link to sort of prove evolution, because you don't see the missing link between two species or whatever. And that's just completely bogus. Again, that's just another case of people not knowing what they're talking about, because the fossil record is really, really, really good, actually. Like, when we find something that we haven't seen before, we know exactly where to slot it in, because we've got so much stuff already. It's not like we find things and we're kind of like, oh, that's weird. What's that thing? It's like we find something and we're like, oh yeah, that goes right here. Like, we know exactly where in sort of the chronological scale, I guess, in the time span where things go.
Right. It's extremely rare that archaeologists get surprised as they're digging up fossils anymore. In fact, we're so good at it that people can guess ahead of time what layers in rock and where in the world they need to dig in order to find the sorts of things they're looking for. This is how the fossil Tiktaalik was discovered. A team of archaeologists were like, well, we know what sort of thing we're looking for. We want this bony lobe-finned fish, and so we know what layer in rock to search for and where in the world to go. And they went and looked in that layer of rock, and they found exactly what they wanted.
Yeah. So, I mean, again, when people say that there's no transitional species, or that the fossil record is incomplete, or that somehow we're looking for this missing link that we haven't found yet, that's just completely bogus, and the people who are propagating these ideas either, one, are being dishonest, or two, just don't know how much information there is out there.
Right. Well, okay, so where is this coming from? We know that when organisms die, it's actually pretty unlikely that they're going to get fossilized. You know, you've got predators that are going to scatter the bones. That's a possibility. They might just be completely eaten or dissolved by, like, bacteria. So some, like, soft, fleshy thing like a clam probably not going to have a very high likelihood of being fossilized because there's nothing there. The things that fossilize really easily, like I was saying earlier, are these big bony animals. The high calcium content in bones, that makes you very likely to be fossilized. So that's a good candidate for something like that. And so we know that some things just don't get fossilized. And to some extent, we should have the expectation that we're not going to find every single organism that has ever existed in the fossil record, right?
Yeah.
And so I guess what they're trying to say is that, well, there's all these things that are missing from the fossil record, and so until we have a complete fossil record of everything that's ever existed, we shouldn't just say evolution happened. But I think that that's wrong, because we should expect that there are some things that we're just never going to find. We should accept that, because we know how geological forces work on biological organisms. Soft, fleshy tissue doesn't get preserved very well. But when you've got a huge proportion of exactly what you should expect to find if evolution is true. You know, one animal that you find a similar form like a million years later, and you find another similar form a million years after that. I mean, you're filling in a huge amount of the picture. It's like someone putting together a jigsaw puzzle, And you can see that 80% of the picture is in place. It's clearly like a car with some flowers in the background, but not all the pieces are in place.
Yeah.
And maybe not all the pieces will ever be put in place. But you have enough information to piece together what's going on in the picture. And we've got the same exact thing in the fossil record. We have enough transitional forms. We have a long enough record going far enough back with enough species from enough different parts of the world that we can very confidently at this point say what was most likely to be going on. And it lines up very, very well with our understanding of evolution.
Yeah. And as far as like human evolution is concerned, which is the big deal anyways, because the reason, I mean, at the end of the day, the reason why all these people don't think evolution is real is because they don't want it to be, because, you know, God created Adam and Eve as people, not as bacterial flagellum, you know. So since the Bible doesn't say, or the Quran doesn't say in their creation story, that the reason why people exist today is because of all these years of evolution, it just says that we poofed into existence by a magical incantation in the form that we are in today. Doesn't line up with their religious views. But so as far as the fossil record is concerned, as far as how did humans get to where they are today, humans and our predecessors are not soft, clammy things that don't fossilize. So when you look at the record that we have of human evolution and what early man was like, we have a pretty good record. And so it's not even as if there's a bunch of guesswork at play with humans.
Right.
And that's the extra frustrating thing, is it's like, there may be, and again, I'm not an expert, surprise, surprise, if you're a listener of the show, but I'm not an expert at this. There may be some species where it is a lot of guesswork, like, oh, well, you know, we're not really sure, but it looks like maybe this, maybe that. Could be one or two things that, you know, sort of came out of this and turned into this other thing. But with humans, that's not even the case. We know. Like, we've got it pretty well sorted out, don't we?
Yeah. Humans are big, bony animals, and they evolved relatively recently, so we have lots and lots of fossils of the evolution and development of humans.
Yeah, so when people talk about the missing link for, you know, humans, it's like, well, I'm sorry, but that's not a thing anymore. We're not looking for a missing link anymore. You know, we've got enough of the picture to know. So, yeah, it's kind of frustrating, if you couldn't tell already by the timbre in my voice.
All right, here's another objection to evolution. This is getting a little bit more into the genetics of evolution. Someone might say that mutations are always negative, so we can't be getting better and better and more advanced from just a bunch of mutations, right?
It's funny that you bring that up, because that was the other thing that I thought I was going to maybe talk about. But it's
almost as if the same dumb objections come up over and over again.
Yeah. Well, I was watching, and again, this is one of those things that I'm not an expert on, but sort of in preparing for the show, I was sort of perusing the Aaron Ra's Foundational Falsehoods of Creationism video series on YouTube, which is an absolutely phenomenal video series that I would recommend to anybody.
That is a good video series. I like that.
No matter what your views are, he just puts down a lot of really good information. He obviously knows what he's talking about, and it's really well presented. And basically, he says, you know, he's got like stock footage of this like creationist lady who she's maybe not even a Christian, maybe a Muslim or, you know, a Hindu or something. I don't know. Is standing in front of a green screen wearing a lab coat, and she's obviously not an actual scientist, but she's playing one. And she says that science has found that every single mutation that ever happens is as a negative mutation and results in bad things happening. So there's no way that mutations could possibly result in humans becoming better suited to the environment that they live in, of things of that nature. And Aaron Ra basically says, well, that's not true, because almost every single mutation that happens is completely neutral.
Right.
They don't really have a profound effect on sort of our ability to survive in our environment. And so they are largely irrelevant to like the propagation of our species. And also goes on to point out that there are several good, I guess you could say good, positive, whatever, mutations, such as people tending to be more and more immune to like one disease over another group of people. And you can trace that mutation back to like a single ancestor. So, you know, mutations can be good things and they can be bad things, but most of the time they're not really even a thing that we need to be worried about at all.
Yeah, they're overwhelmingly neutral. They really have almost no effect on the gene.
Oh, and another thing that people will say is that mutations don't add any new information, and I'm putting information in air quotes, because that's just sort of a word that people like to use that doesn't really make a whole lot of sense in this context. People's sort of the layman's definition of the word.
Well, no, it does make a lot of sense. Information has a huge role to play in genetics and biology and stuff like that. But the problem is that most people don't understand information. They don't have like a good idea of what Shannon information is. That like hardly anyone takes an information sciences or information theory course. It's a really esoteric field to get into.
Yeah. Well, I was going to say, I feel like the layman's definition of the word information and the way that they're using it in this context, it's going to lead to misunderstandings about what these mutations actually are.
Right.
And so that was the only point I wanted to make with that. But, so that also is largely false, is it not? I mean, new information.
That's entirely false, yeah. You can have some mutations that don't create new information, but you can have other mutations that do create lots of information. So, for example, genes code for information. Let's say we've got a gene and it's coding a couple of letters. It just says AGT, all right? Now, let's say you have one type of mutation, I think this is called a point mutation, where you just change one of those little things. So instead of saying AGT, it now says ATT, all right?
Yeah.
So that doesn't create any new information, that just changes what information was already there. But you can have other types of information where you say that again. So you might have had AGT, and now you can have other kinds of mutations again where you say AGT, ATT. I don't want to be getting too weird and like just saying letters over and over again. But like there's different types of mutations. Some create information, some don't. Some destroy information. Sure, that's true as well.
Some add things, some flip-flop things, some take things out. It can be a lot of things.
Yeah, exactly. Now, the other thing, when you're talking about genes, this kind of objection sort of misses out on a huge and important area, and that's the environment that the organism is in. For the most part, there aren't actually bad genes. There's very few genes that would just be inherently bad. Instead, you have interactions between the genes and environment, some of which are good and some of which are bad. So one type of mutation that might be really bad in one environment might be really good in another environment. So an example of this sort of like gene-environment interaction thing is humans are not able to synthesize our own vitamin C, which is a really, really important part in a lot of stuff in our bodies. Our growth, our immune systems all really rely pretty heavily on vitamin C.
You need it to live.
Yes. Now, here's a funny piece of information. Almost every other mammal that needs vitamin C in its body can just make it from other stuff. It doesn't need vitamin C as a part of its diet, but because humans aren't able to synthesize it, we need to ingest it. I mean, that's definitely a bad mutation, right? We could just eat other stuff that doesn't have vitamin C, and our diets would be more flexible. We wouldn't need to have vitamin C, right? So that's definitely a bad thing, right?
Yeah.
Well, like I was saying earlier, it's probably going to depend on the environment. This mutation probably happened in an environment where humans already had a diet that was very rich in vitamin C, so we didn't need to bother making lots and lots of vitamin C. If we lost that gene, whatever, no one cares. We're already ingesting lots of it in the first place. So the machinery and the biochemistry that you need to synthesize vitamin C is actually rather complex. So if you don't need to bother making that stuff anymore because you can just eat your own vitamin C all the time whenever you want, doesn't matter. But now that we find ourselves in other environments where vitamin C is a more precious commodity, we kind of wish we had that gene still.
Yeah.
But when that mutation happened in the first place, it wasn't a problem at all. So you need to make sure you're looking at not just genes and not just environments, but gene and environment interactions.
Yeah, that's very interesting.
Now, the way I had phrased this objection in the first place has an additional problem in it. I had said that mutations are always negative, so we can't be getting better and more advanced over time. The idea of us getting better and more advanced over time is kind of a red herring. It doesn't make sense either.
Yeah.
We don't get better and advanced over time. All that happens is we get better suited to reproduce in our environment. And if that means we get smaller and less sophisticated, so be it. That's going to be the direction that the forces of evolution push us in.
Yeah.
All right. Eric, do you have any others?
That's it. I'm all done.
I've got one more.
All right.
This is going to be a long episode. So this is another bad objection to evolution I've got. This is a quote from Cliff Knetley in a debate he was doing with Matt Dillahunty. Eric and our listeners, you may remember Cliff Knetley. That was the guy that Matthew Ferguson had been interfacing with and who had the 1042 apologetic and stuff like that.
Yeah, I remember that.
Yeah. All right, so Cliff says, quote, 21% of our atmosphere is oxygen. If it were 25%, fires would break out everywhere and we'd burn to death. If it were 15%, we would all suffocate. Life is balanced on a razor's edge. This incredible design is not rationally attributable to random chance, but has to be the product of an intelligent, intentional creator. All right, that's spot on, isn't it?
I mean, yeah, I've heard a lot of arguments like this before, like the argument of like, there's an umbrella term for this, but like the argument that like the universe is too...
This is fine-tuning.
Yeah, the fine-tuning argument, right, like, well, if this was just a little bit different, then we wouldn't exist, so that means somebody must have put it there on purpose. Like, okay, well, the first thing that I think of is, okay, well, it's not too persuasive to me to say, well, if things were different, they'd be different. Yeah, okay, correct. If things were different, they'd be different. I understand that.
Yeah, okay, so as far as this being a part of the fine-tuning arguments, it's funny, actually, because there are some really interesting and somewhat sophisticated fine-tuning arguments, but Cliff has chosen one that is not interesting and not sophisticated and not even mildly compelling. This is just a really basic misunderstanding about the mechanism of natural selection. First of all, as far as this being on a razor's edge, the plus or minus 5% thing that Cliff is talking about is not much of a razor's edge. That's a huge plateau.
Yeah.
Okay, but regardless, we do have this upper limit on the amount of oxygen that can be in the atmosphere that life can tolerate. If there's so much oxygen that everything is just constantly on fire, then yes, that's going to be a problem for life.
Yeah. But I mean, if there were more oxygen, life would have adapted in a different way such that that wouldn't be a problem.
So the number that Cliff gives is actually a little bit low. It's probably more like the mid-30s, but, regardless, there's some number. Sure, no problem. But even then, you still have to actually take into consideration that number, that percentage of oxygen in the atmosphere is going to be dependent on a lot of different things, like temperature and air pressure. You can actually get a very high percentage of oxygen levels in the air if you have a low air pressure and you don't have any risk of fire. So there's still other factors going on here. But regardless, like, Eric, so what you're starting to drive at right now is there's other things that you need to keep in mind. So plants don't give a shit about the oxygen levels because oxygen is just a waste product. That's something they're like filtering into the atmosphere. So as long as they're not on fire, plants are going to be pretty insensitive to oxygen levels.
Yeah.
And the other thing is, I mean, oxygen levels in the atmosphere would have very little to do with aquatic life. I mean, if the oxygen levels in the atmosphere went up or went down, you could still have very robust aquatic life, even if everything on the surface died.
Yeah.
The other problem with this sort of objection is it's misunderstanding natural selection. So, Eric, like you were saying, if things were different, they'd be different. And what that means is if we had different conditions on Earth, you can say that all life would be wiped out, but you might have completely different life. You might have other life that lives underwater or lives around undersea vents. Cliff is acting like changing the conditions on the Earth so that humans die would be really bad and that that's some sort of special situation, but I don't think that's the case. I mean, the situations that humans happen to be able to live in is one of many possible situations that you can find on the Earth. Just the fact that humans might die doesn't really matter. I don't understand why Cliff is so concerned about oxygen levels.
The whole thing is just kind of silly.
Right. Life actually probably started off when the Earth had very, very low, in fact, negligible oxygen levels. Unlike the prebiotic Earth, it was almost no oxygen, at least no molecular oxygen, floating around in the atmosphere, and then the life that evolved started to generate oxygen as a waste byproduct of its own metabolism. And then once you get oxygen in place, other life that can utilize that can sort of take off.
It kind of reminds me of, and this is not really related, I guess, but surprise, surprise, I'm going to talk about something that's not related to what we're talking about.
Is it hockey?
No, it reminds me of in the intro, I think it's in the intro to Christopher Hitchens' book, God's Not Great. He's talking about how when he was like a young person, his school teacher told him that God, how nice of God to make most of like nature and like stuff green, because green is the color that is most easy for our eyes to look at. Like it's the most like nice, suitable color.
It's a soothing color for humans.
Right.
Yeah.
So how nice of God to make everything green so that it would be nice and soothing to our eyes. And even at that young age, he was like, okay, that's clearly obviously not the way it happened. Like obviously everything's green. And so that our eyes adapted to make green a soothing color to look at, not the other way around. You know what I mean?
Right.
And so that's kind of what that Cliff Knetley argument makes me think of.
Yeah, it's kind of a dumb thing to say. Like I was saying, I do think there are interesting formulations of the fine-tuning argument, but Cliff chose a really stupid one. Anyway, this, of course, was not an exhaustive list of all the bad objections to evolution, and the ones that we did cover, we did not give an exhaustive list of all the ways that they're bad or don't actually address evolution.
It's a long enough episode already without us doing that.
Yeah, I think so. But for our listeners, I will post a couple of links on the website of other stuff they can read through or paw through if they're interested in checking out other ways that people have given bad objections to evolution. So that will be up if people are interested. We are going to have a couple of other people on to talk about evolution with us, and then we're going to finish this little series about evolution off with an episode I'm super excited for, which is good objections to evolution.
I'm going to be out of my element in that episode. I'm not going to know what to say.
So that'll be a fun episode. I'm looking forward to that. But this is supposed to be kind of finishing off the evolution series that we had done last year for Darwin Day, and then it didn't end up working out. But anyway.
As often things tend to not do on this show, it didn't work out.
But anyway, hopefully people will find our next couple of episodes interesting, and hopefully they get a lot out of them.
I hope so. I hope so, Gabriel.
Yeah. Well, this has been fun. All right, Eric, evolve us off.
Just all of our listeners, make sure that you tune into the next episode of Duck Dynasty so that you can see why you don't want to watch it.
It's pronounced NonTheology.
And make sure you don't let any gay people get married, or else communism and mass murder will ensue.
Goodbye! Goodbye, listeners!